8:42 p.m., August 17, 1943. Peenemunde Army Research Center, Baltic coast of Germany. The night sky above the island of Usedom was unnaturally clear. At the control bunker near Proofstand 7, floodlights cut through the darkness, illuminating a tall, skeletal shape rising from its launch platform. The object stood 14 meters high, weighed nearly 13 metric tons, and was filled with liquid oxygen and ethanol. It was designated Aggregat 4. The men standing beneath it would soon call it something else. Vergeltungswaffe 2, V2. At the edge of the concrete apron stood Wernher von Braun, age 31, technical director of Germany's rocket program. He wore a gray Luftwaffe engineer's uniform, his rank equivalent to captain. His face was thin, controlled, and betraying nothing. The countdown clock inside the bunker read T-minus 90 seconds. Von Braun was not watching the rocket. He was watching the instruments. At 20:43, the ignition sequence began. Turbopumps spun up at 4,000 revolutions per minute. Superheated steam, produced by hydrogen peroxide decomposition, forced fuel into the combustion chamber. A white plume poured from the exhaust deflector. The engine reached full thrust, 25 metric tons, more force than any weapon ever built. At 20:44, the clamps released. The V2 rose vertically, cleared the tower in less than 2 seconds, and disappeared into the dark Baltic sky at nearly 1,600 meters per second. There was no sound after the first roar. Within moments, it was beyond hearing, beyond sight, and beyond reach. Inside the bunker, the tracking radar confirmed what von Braun already suspected. The missile had gone supersonic. At that exact moment, Allied intelligence had no idea what had just happened. Across the English Channel, British radar stations saw nothing. Fighter Command detected no bombers. Anti-aircraft batteries stood idle. No siren sounded. No interception was attempted, because interception was impossible. What Germany had just launched could not be stopped. The origins of this moment went back more than a decade. In 1932, the German Army Weapons Office quietly began funding experimental rocket research, exploiting legal loopholes in the Treaty of Versailles. Rockets, unlike artillery, were not restricted. Captain Walter Dornberger, an artillery officer with a talent for engineering, took command of the project. He needed a civilian scientist to lead it. He chose Wernher von Braun. By 1937, the team relocated to Peenemunde, a remote test site on the Baltic Sea, far from prying eyes. The base expanded rapidly. Wind tunnels, engine test stands, guidance labs, housing for thousands of workers. By 1941, Peenemunde employed over 10,000 personnel, including engineers, technicians, and later, forced laborers. The goal was clear: build a long-range missile capable of delivering a 1,000-kilogram warhead over 300 kilometers. No nation on Earth had ever attempted such a thing. Development was brutal and fast. Early test rockets exploded on the pad. Guidance systems failed. Engines tore themselves apart. On June 13, 1942, Aggregat 4 Test V4 detonated seconds after liftoff, scattering debris across the range. Dornberger demanded results. The Army demanded results. Hitler demanded results. At 15:45 on October 3, 1942, the breakthrough came. Test Vehicle V4 reached an altitude of 84.5 kilometers, crossed the edge of space, and impacted 190 kilometers downrange. The missile traveled faster than the speed of sound for most of its flight. It struck its target area with no warning. Dornberger turned to von Braun and said, "Today, space travel has been born." What neither man said aloud was that ballistic missile warfare had been born with it. By 1943, Germany was losing the war in the air. Allied bombers struck Hamburg, the Ruhr, and Berlin with increasing intensity. German fighter production could not keep pace. Anti-aircraft guns consumed enormous resources for diminishing returns. Hitler wanted a decisive weapon, something that bypassed air defenses entirely. The V-2 fit perfectly. At 900 hours on July 7, 1943, Hitler personally authorized mass production. He ordered the missile operational within a year. It was an impossible timeline. Germany met it anyway. Construction of the production facility began in August 1943 inside the Kohnstein mountain near Nordhausen. The underground complex, later known as Mittelwerk, stretched over 20 kilometers of tunnels. Assembly lines ran day and night. The workforce came from the nearby Dora Mittelbau concentration camp. Prisoners worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week. They handled liquid oxygen plumbing, gyroscopes, and explosive warheads with no training. Collapse was common. Sabotage was punished by hanging in front of the entire barracks. By January 1944, Mittelwerk was producing over 600 missiles per month. No other advanced weapon in the war moved from prototype to mass deployment at that speed. Allied intelligence began to sense something was wrong, but too late. Aerial reconnaissance photos of Peenemunde showed unusual launch structures. Prisoner interrogations mentioned rockets. The British mounted Operation Hydra, a bombing raid on August 18, 1943, dropping nearly 600 tons of bombs on the site. The raid killed several engineers and delayed development by weeks. It did not stop the program. By spring 1944, the V-2 was ready. At 1838, September 8, 1944, the first operational V-2 struck London. It landed on Staveley Road, Chiswick. There was no warning, no aircraft noise, no siren, no time to react. The missile impacted at Mach 3, creating a crater 12 meters wide. 13 civilians were killed instantly. Dozens more were wounded. Buildings collapsed inward as if crushed from below. British authorities initially blamed a gas main explosion. They had no other explanation. Within days, more impacts followed. London, Antwerp, Liège. At peak deployment, Germany launched up to 100 V-2s per week. Each missile carried a 1-ton Amatol warhead. Each followed a ballistic arc, reaching altitudes of 80 to 90 kilometers before plunging straight down. There was no defense. Radar detected the missile only after it was already descending. Fighters could not climb fast enough. Anti-aircraft guns could not track it. Civil defense measures were useless. For the first time in history, a weapon rendered all existing defenses obsolete overnight. Allied intelligence officers were stunned, not by the damage, but by the speed of development. From first successful flight to battlefield deployment in less than 2 years, no precedent existed. By the end of 1944, the V-2 had killed over 2,700 civilians. Strategically, it changed nothing. Militarily, it drained German resources. Each missile cost as much as a 4-engine bomber and delivered a smaller payload. But technologically, it changed everything. Every major power watching understood the implication. Wars would never be limited to the front lines again. And this was only the beginning. War documentary. 06:12 a.m., September 10, 1944. Antwerp, Belgium. The missile was already falling when the radar operators saw it. At a Royal Air Force tracking station outside the city, the scope flickered briefly, an anomalous return, too fast, too steep. The operator marked it, confused. He had no time to report it. At 06:13, the V-2 struck the Teniersplas, a crowded district near the docks. The warhead detonated on impact. A fireball rolled through the street, lifting tram cars off their rails. Brick buildings collapsed inward. The shockwave shattered windows over a kilometer away. 168 people were killed in under a second. There had been no warning. There never was. By mid-September, Allied command understood the truth. This was not sabotage. It was not accidental explosions. It was not an aircraft-delivered weapon. It was something entirely new. On September 12th, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force issued an intelligence summary marked Top Secret. The assessment was blunt. Germany had operational ballistic missiles. The report noted the estimated speed at impact, over 3,500 kilometers per hour, and the maximum altitude, likely exceeding 80 kilometers. The weapon could not be intercepted. Civil defense countermeasures were ineffective. Psychological impact was severe. For the first time since the Blitz, Londoners were facing an attack they could not hear coming. At Peenemunde, the engineers watched the reports closely. Wernher von Braun read translated British newspapers detailing the destruction. He made no public comment. Internally, he argued that the missile was being misused. He believed the V-2 should have been developed further, improved accuracy, higher reliability, potential for spaceflight. Accuracy, however, was already remarkable for its time. The V-2's guidance system relied on two gyroscopes controlling pitch and yaw, feeding signals into graphite veins inside the exhaust plume. A primitive onboard analog computer adjusted thrust until cutoff, determining range. Typical circular error probable was 10 to 20 kilometers, imprecise by modern standards, but sufficient for city targets. No pilot, no radio guidance, no human correction. Once launched, the missile was autonomous. Logistics drove the pace. Each V-2 required 8.5 tons of liquid oxygen, produced in specialized plants vulnerable to bombing. Ethanol fuel had to be refined, transported, and stored. Launch units, designated Artillery Abteilung 836 and others, used mobile firing platforms to avoid detection. The firing process took approximately 4 hours from arrival to launch. Crews erected the missile vertically, fueled it, aligned gyros, and evacuated the area before ignition. Once launched, the unit displaced immediately. By October 1944, German units were firing from the Netherlands, reducing flight time to London to under 5 minutes. Still no warning. Allied response focused on disruption. Bombers targeted fuel plants, rail lines, and launch areas. Reconnaissance aircraft searched for firing sites. Intelligence units analyzed debris fragments, measuring alloys, engine parts, wiring. By November, American analysts concluded that the missile represented a technological breakthrough, but not a war-winning weapon. The cost-benefit ratio was unfavorable. Germany had built over 6,000 V-2s. More than 3,000 were launched. Tens of thousands died in production facilities alone, far more than were killed by impacts. The missile was fast, but the Reich was running out of time. At 2:30 a.m., March 27, 1945, the last V-2 struck England. It landed in Orpington, Kent. 2 people were killed. Within weeks, Allied ground forces overran launch sites and captured Mittelwerk intact. What they found shocked even hardened investigators. Underground tunnels filled with half-assembled missiles, technical drawings, engine test data, production logs detailing output numbers, and the evidence of forced labor. The V-2 program had been built on mass death. On May 2, 1945, as Soviet forces closed in, Wernher von Braun made a decision. He surrendered to the Americans. At 9:45, near Reutte, Austria, Braun and several senior engineers approached a U.S. Army patrol. He identified himself calmly. He stated his profession. He said he wished to surrender. Within hours, American intelligence understood what they had captured. Not just men, but the future. Under Operation Paperclip, the United States quietly transferred over 100 German rocket specialists to America. Von Braun was among them. So were engineers, technicians, and test data, entire rail cars of documents and hardware. They were sent first to Fort Bliss, Texas, then to White Sands Proving Ground. There, on the New Mexico desert floor, American soldiers watched something familiar rise into the sky. A V-2, painted with U.S. markings. At 10:03 a.m., April 16, 1946, a captured V-2 was launched from White Sands. It followed the same arc, the same roar, the same sudden silence as it passed the sound barrier. This time, the data was American. The U.S. Army measured every variable: thrust curves, vibration, guidance stability. Cameras mounted in the nose captured the first photographs of Earth from space. The missile reached 104 kilometers. The age of ballistic missiles had crossed the Atlantic. Von Braun adapted quickly. By 1950, he was working on the Redstone missile, directly descended from the V-2, but improved, longer range, better accuracy, safer handling. The Redstone would later launch America's first astronaut. The technology that once terrorized cities now lifted men into orbit. But the moral weight never vanished. By the early Cold War, every major power understood the lesson first revealed over London in 1944. Speed mattered more than warning. Altitude mattered more than armor. A weapon that could not be intercepted changed strategy forever. Intercontinental ballistic missiles followed. Nuclear warheads followed them. The V-2 was crude by comparison, but it was the template. Today, remnants of the program sit in museums. A V-2 stands at the Smithsonian, another at the Imperial War Museum. Their black and white paint schemes are clean. Their placards are neutral. They do not show the tunnels. They do not show the bodies. They do not show the night sky over Peenemunde at 8:44 when a weapon outran sound itself. What shocked American intelligence was not simply how fast Germany built the V-2. It was how fast the future arrived.
Way documentary. 7:30 a.m., June 20th, 1947. White Sands Proving Ground, New Mexico. The desert was already hot. Technicians in U.S. Army fatigues moved deliberately across the launch area, checking cables, fuel lines, and guidance housings. The missile on the pad stood upright against a pale sky. Its shape was unmistakable: slender body, swept fins, blunt nose cone. It was a V-2, designation MW18014, assembled from captured German components. Standing several hundred meters away was Wernher von Braun, now 35 years old. He wore civilian clothes, no uniform, no insignia. He held a clipboard and watched the final checks in silence. At 07:58 a.m., the launch officer called out the final sequence. At 8 a.m., the missile lifted off. The engine burned for 65 seconds. The rocket climbed straight up, then pitched over smoothly. Tracking cameras followed it until it vanished into the upper atmosphere. Telemetry streamed back to ground stations in real time. When the missile impacted downrange, the data confirmed what U.S. analysts already knew. This was no longer a German weapon. It was an American prototype. The transfer of knowledge happened faster than anyone expected. By 1948, the U.S. Army, Navy, and Air Force were competing for control of long-range missile development. Each branch cited the same evidence, the V-2, the same diagrams, the same captured engineers. At Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama, von Braun's team expanded rapidly. They trained American engineers, rewrote German documentation in English, and rebuilt test infrastructure from scratch. The result was the PGM-11 Redstone missile. It stood 21 meters tall, weighed 27 metric tons, and had a range of 320 kilometers. Its engine produced 350 kilonewtons of thrust, nearly double the V-2. Its guidance system was more reliable. Its fuel handling was safer. It was still a ballistic missile, and it was still unstoppable. Across the ocean, the Soviet Union reached the same conclusion. Captured German engineers had been taken east. Entire V-2 factories were dismantled and rebuilt outside Moscow. Soviet scientists studied the same blueprints, the same engines, the same mistakes. By 1957, the Soviets launched R-7 Semyorka, the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile. It could deliver a nuclear warhead over 8,000 kilometers. The V-2's shadow had grown global. Back in Germany, the legacy was more complicated. Peenemunde was abandoned, then partially dismantled. Mittelwerk became a crime scene. Investigators documented mass graves, execution sites, and production logs. Survivors testified to conditions underground: darkness, disease, starvation. The weapon that heralded the future had been built in hell. Von Braun was questioned repeatedly. He denied direct responsibility for labor conditions. He admitted knowledge. He expressed regret. He was never prosecuted. History moved on. By 1960, ballistic missiles defined strategy. Early warning radar networks spanned continents. Launch-on-warning doctrines were written. The concept of deterrence replaced battlefield victory. The speed first demonstrated by the V-2 meant there would be minutes, sometimes seconds, to decide the fate of nations. Missile silos replaced artillery batteries. Cities replaced front lines. The V-2's most enduring impact was not physical destruction, but time compression. Decision-making shrank. Error margins vanished. Von Braun's career reached its peak on July 16, 1969. At 09:32 a.m. Eastern Time, a Saturn V rocket lifted off from Launch Complex 39A at Cape Kennedy. The vehicle stood 110 meters tall and generated 34 million newtons of thrust. It was not a weapon, but its lineage was unmistakable. Von Braun watched from the control center. He was 57 years old. His hair was gray, his accent still German. When the rocket cleared the tower, he allowed himself a brief smile. 3 days later, humans walked on the moon. Yet the question remained, could that achievement be separated from its origins? Military historians continued to debate it. Engineers focused on performance metrics. Ethicists focused on cost. Museums displayed the hardware without the context. But the timeline was undeniable. from the first successful V-2 flight in October 1942 to operational deployment in September 1944, less than 2 years. From battlefield terror to spaceflight within less than 3 decades. No other weapon system had accelerated history so violently. Today, modern ballistic missiles travel at Mach 20. They maneuver, they carry multiple warheads. Some are launched from submarines hidden beneath oceans. Others sit in hardened silos, ready within minutes. None of that existed before the V-2. The concept did, a rocket that could not be stopped. In London and Antwerp, memorials mark impact sites, small plaques, dates, numbers. They do not list altitudes. They do not list thrust ratings. They do not mention gyroscopes or turbopumps. They remember the absence of warning. At Peenemunde, a museum now stands where Proefstand 7 once operated. Visitors walk past engine bells and guidance assemblies. Children look up at the missile's height. Tour guides explain its role in history. Few realize how close the world came to this future arriving even sooner. Had Germany stabilized production earlier? Had accuracy improved faster? Had resources not been diverted? The shock felt in U.S. intelligence in 1944 was not fear of defeat. It was recognition. Recognition that warfare had crossed a threshold. The V-2 did not win the war. It changed the rules. And once those rules changed, there was no way back.
War documentary. 11:18 a.m., October 3, 1972. Huntsville, Alabama. The auditorium was quiet. Rows of engineers, military officers, and civilian officials sat facing the stage. At the podium stood Wernher von Braun, now 60 years old. His posture was slightly stooped. His voice was softer than it had been decades earlier, but still precise. He was speaking about propulsion efficiency. Not about war. Not about Peenemunde. Not about London or Antwerp. But every person in the room understood the connection. By the early 1970s, ballistic missile technology had matured into something final. Intercontinental missiles sat on hair-trigger alert. Submarines carried hidden launch platforms beneath the oceans. Warheads could reach targets across the globe in under 30 minutes, some in under 15. None of this was theoretical. Every system in place, guidance, propulsion, staging, could trace its lineage directly back to the V-2. The weapon that U.S. intelligence had once struggled to comprehend had become the backbone of global deterrence. Von Braun retired from NASA in 1972. He had spent the post-war decades shaping America's missile and space programs, training generations of engineers who had never seen war. He wrote books, gave lectures, and appeared on television explaining science to the public. But history did not forget his first great creation. Scholars revisited the V-2 not as a curiosity, but as a turning point. Military academies studied it as the moment warfare detached from the battlefield. Engineers studied it as the first system to combine propulsion, guidance, and automation into a single weapon. Ethicists studied it as a warning. The numbers told a stark story. Approximately 20,000 prisoners died producing the V-2. Fewer than 3,000 civilians were killed by its impacts. The weapon killed far more people before it ever left the ground. That imbalance became part of its legacy. Modern missile doctrine absorbed the lesson. Speed removes choice. Altitude removes defense. Automation removes hesitation.
From the moment the V-2 crossed the sound barrier in 1942, war entered an era where human reaction time no longer mattered. That reality shaped every conflict that followed, even those where missiles were never launched. Today, fragments of the V-2 are scattered across museums and archives. A combustion chamber here, a guidance unit there, a faded photograph of a launch crew standing too close to a fueled missile, unaware of how unstable it truly was. They are artifacts of transition. At Peenemunde, the launch pad no longer echoes. Grass grows through cracked concrete. The Baltic wind blows across empty ground. The control bunkers are silent. But the idea tested there still moves at hypersonic speed. U.S. intelligence was shocked in 1944 because they were witnessing something unprecedented. Not a new bomb, not a new aircraft, but a new relationship between time and war. Germany had built a weapon faster than defenses could adapt. The world has been adapting ever since. The V-2 did not end World War II. It ended an era. From that point forward, the question was never if a missile could be stopped, only whether there would be time to respond.